This video is brought to you by Brilliant. It's hard to know how Russia's economy is actually doing these days. On the one hand, there seems to be an emerging consensus in not just the Russian, but also the Western media that the Russian economy has drastically outperformed expectations, and its continued success means the Kremlin is well placed to fight a long, attritional war in Ukraine. On the other hand, Western politicians claim that Russia is lying about its economic performance. Just last week, 8 European finance ministers penned a joint letter in The Guardian arguing that sanctions are actually working and calling for more on top of the expanded sanctions introduced by the US in June. Of course, these claims can't both be true, so in this video we thought we'd try and figure out who's right, how Russia's economy is actually doing, and whether its apparent overperformance is sustainable. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, the first thing to say is that Russia's official economic data should be taken with a pinch of salt. This is, in part, because it's incomplete and possibly manipulated. The Russian statistical authority, Rosstat, stopped publishing some data series immediately after the invasion began, and while it's resumed some of them, we still don't get as much data as we did. But it's also because different parts of the Russian state give different numbers. Last year, for instance, when Gazprom announced that gas production had fallen by nearly 15%, Putin just denied it flat out and claimed that it was actually rising. Nonetheless, the fact that estimates by financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank generally accord with Rosstat does suggest that, at least when it comes to the big macro numbers, Russia's internal data is broadly accurate. And if this is the case, then it's hard to deny that, so far, the Russian economy is faring better than most Western politicians imagined when they imposed sanctions. According to Rosstat, Russia's GDP declined by 1.2% in 2022, but returned to growth in 2023, when GDP grew by 3.6%. On top of that, in its most recent forecast, the IMF announced that they expect Russia's economy to grow by 3.2% this year, faster than any other developed economy, including not just European economies, but also the US. Now, of course, a lot of this growth has been driven by military spending, which is expected to grow by about 70% in 2024 and account for nearly a third of the federal budget. While military spending counts towards GDP, it's not good GDP per se. Because, well, you're just building tanks only for them to get blown up. Nonetheless, because most of this new military spending has gone to blue and grey-collar workers in Russia's poorer regions, economic equality has declined markedly over the past 2 years or so, with poorer workers seeing the steepest rises in real income. A tight labour market has actually pushed wages up across the board, with real wage growth coming in at nearly 6% last year and unemployment falling to a record post-Soviet low of 2.6%. Strong wages, combined with the fact that poor people generally spend a larger fraction of their income, have bolstered domestic demand within Russia, helping offset the collapse in foreign demand caused by sanctions. On top of that, inflation has been lower than expected. When sanctions were first imposed, many analysts believed the subsequent drop in the ruble and Russian imports would push inflation to unprecedented highs. But despite a brief spike immediately after the war, when inflation reached 17.8% in April 2022, inflation fell relatively quickly, bottoming out at 2.3% a year later. So why has Russia's economy outperformed expectations? Well, some of it is to do with stuff we've covered in previous videos. Energy sanctions, for instance, were phased in too slowly, and the accompanying disruption actually pushed up global energy prices, which meant that even when Russia was selling at a discount, the Kremlin was still turning a hefty profit. Russia has also been able to find substitutes for most sanctioned imports from China, much to the chagrin of the West, and clever interventionist monetary policy from its central bank helped temper down inflation in the early days of the war. However, in retrospect, it also looks like Russia was in a uniquely strong position to wage war under sanctions, for 3 reasons. First, Russia had enormous stockpiles of old Soviet-era weapons, which meant that sanctions on arms imports weren't all that effective. Second, Russia had a large pool of poor, unemployed men, who could be quickly and cheaply mobilized without putting too much strain on the labor market. But third, Russia also had a lot of what we might call fiscal space. In other words, before the war, the Russian state really didn't spend much money. Thanks to the fact that Russia only has a 13% flat tax, revenues represented just 24% of GDP, roughly half of that of France and 2/3 of that of the UK. The Russian state also borrowed very little money, running tiny budget deficits and occasional surpluses. This allowed Russia to keep its national debt remarkably low and build up significant reserves, some of which were seized after the invasion. Russia's national debt was only 16% of GDP in 2021, and it had enough reserves to pay off all its external debt immediately. The Kremlin ran budget deficits in 2022 and 2023, mostly funded by borrowing from its National Welfare Fund. But Russia's debt-to-GDP ratio is still below 20% of GDP. The point we're making is that the Russian state really wasn't spending or borrowing very much money before the war, so it could easily increase spending to fund the war, especially because there were lots of unemployed young men to fill the new jobs. The Kremlin has also been able to increase its tax revenues by introducing a new progressive income tax ranging from 15 to 22% and an increase in corporation tax from 20% to 25%. Together, these measures are expected to bring the state an additional 28 trillion rubles, roughly $300 billion, over the next 6 years. However, even if Russia was in an undeniably strong position to begin with, its stockpiles of weapons, men, and cash aren't infinite, and there's tentative evidence suggesting that they're already running out. The steep increase in the cost of recruitment contracts, which have risen tenfold in certain regions since last year, plus the recent announcement that the Kremlin would be doubling the presidential payment for new recruits, imply that Russia is essentially running out of men. This would also explain why inflation, having bottomed out last year, has started rising again to nearly 9% year on year. Russia just doesn't have enough workers to fill the new jobs created by the new military spending, creating a tight labour market and therefore higher wages and higher inflation. Now, it's important not to overstate this. Russia's recruitment numbers are still running at around 25,000 a month, roughly the same as last year, and the Kremlin still has a lot of fiscal space to continue funding the war. Nonetheless, recent data does suggest that, even though Russia's economy has outperformed expectations and the Kremlin have found it relatively easy to fund the war so far, continuing the war will get more expensive over time. Be sure to keep an eye on this story as it evolves, as much like every area of our lives, this is likely to progress quickly. In fact, if you're feeling left behind by the news cycle and fast developments in AI and tech, you'll want to check out Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Learning a little every day is one of the most important things you can do, both for personal and professional growth. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time. It's the opposite of mindless scrolling and truly helps you to learn quickly, kind of like TLDR. One course I've found to be particularly interesting was their course on large language models. We hear a lot about AI and large language models in the news, but Brilliant helped me actually get hands-on with real language models as you explore how they build vocabulary, choose their next word, and more. They also helped me grasp the importance of training data by comparing models trained on Taylor Swift lyrics to models trained on a cookbook or big text terms and conditions. If you want to learn more and understand the world around you better, whether that's in order to get a job in AI or just to understand what everyone's talking about, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/TLDR or click on the link in the description. Plus, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching and to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.